In our series on the official studio albums of Bob Dylan, so far we've looked at his breakout when he started in the 60s, and then we looked at his second decade in music, the 70s. Now in this episode, we're going to turn our attention to Bob's third decade in music, the 1980s. So you ready? Let's drop the needle. As we saw at the very end of the 1970s, Bob Dylan converted to Christianity, and he started recording Christian music albums. And he would go on tour and he would refuse to play any of his secular music while he was on tour. Well, the 1980s starts with him recording his second Christian album, which is called Saved. And once again, it's kind of hard for me to get past the proselytizing on this record. The album starts off with A Satisfied Mind, then there is Saved, What Can I Do For You, Pressing On, and In the Garden. The album was a big hit in the UK, reaching number 3, but in the US it only hit number 24. Then in 1981, he releases another Christian album, which is called Shot of Love. But the songs are a little bit more rock-oriented, and some of them are even verging on being secular. I like Shot of Love, Heart of Mine, The Groom Still Waiting at the Altar, and Every Grain of Sand. I must say that of Bob's 3 Christian albums, I think I like this one the best, but it sold the worst. It could only reach number 33 on the charts. In 1983, Bob releases an album that he calls Infidels, and it is a straight-out return to Bob singing about political issues and personal issues. The album opens up with Joker Man, then Sweetheart Like You. I also like License to Kill and Don't Fall Apart on Me Tonight. And the public seemed to like the album too, because it reached number 20 in the US. Bob keeps himself busy in the 80s. In 1985, he releases an album called Empire Burlesque. On this record, he's backed by Ronnie Wood, Mick Taylor, and Mike Campbell, Howie Epstein, and Benmont Tench of the Heartbreakers. The opening song, Tight Connection to My Heart, is released as a single, and I really like this song. I also like Seeing the Real You at Last, Clean Cut Kid, When the Night Comes Falling Down from the Sky, and Dark Eyes. I like this album, but it could only reach number 33 in the US. Later in the year, Bob joins the ensemble singing on the famine relief song, We Are the World. He also joins Artists United Against Apartheid on the single Sun City. And then on July 13th, 1985, Bob Dylan closes out the Live Aid concert in Philadelphia, where he's joined on stage by Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood. And it's during this performance that Bob says that he wishes that some of the money that was being raised to help the starving people in Africa could also be sent to help the farmers in America. And he is widely criticized for what are seen as inappropriate comments. But in fact, those comments inspired Willie Nelson to form Farm Aid, concerts that still go on each year to this day. In 1986, Bob releases an album called Knocked Out Loaded. The songs on this record are really uneven. He covers Chris Christopherson's They Killed Him. He and Tom Petty wrote Got My Mind Made Up, and I like Maybe Someday and Brownsville Girl. But the album didn't do very well. In fact, it could only reach number 53 on the charts here in the US, making it the first time a Bob Dylan album had not cracked the top 50 in the US since his very first album in 1962. In 1986 and 1987, Dylan went on tour with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, and Petty has said that touring with Dylan breathed new life into the Heartbreakers. Now, unfortunately, Bob has not released a live album of that tour, which would be great to hear Tom and Bob playing together. Bob also toured with the Grateful Dead, and they did put out an album called Dylan and the Dead, and frankly, the less said about this album, the better. In 1988, Bob decided to name his tour the Never Ending Tour, which is the tour he's still on and has been doing that for over 30 years. 1988 was a very busy year for Bob Dylan. He gets inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he releases an album called Down in the Groove, which gets universal negative reviews. Even so, I like Let's Stick Together, When Did You Leave Heaven, Silvio, and my favorite song on the album is 90 Miles an Hour Down a Dead-End Street. But Bob Dylan is in a slump. This album could only reach number 61. But Dylan found instant success when he let his friend George Harrison use his home studio. You see, the story was George needed to record a song quickly. And so Bob said, well, you can use my studio to do it. Well, when George showed up, he showed up with a few friends. He had Tom Petty, he had Roy Orbison, and he had Jeff Lynne to help him with this new song. So when they went into Bob's studio, Bob decides that he'll join in. And of course, the song became Handle Me With Care, a huge hit. And the group, of course, became known as the Traveling Wilburys. And I talked about them in a previous episode. You might want to check that out. Energized by his experience in the Traveling Wilburys, Dylan's next album is called Oh Mercy, and it shows him being very confident, and his songwriting certainly shows it on this record. Released in September of 1989, it starts with Political World, Everything is Broken, the great Ring Them Bells, Most of the Time, and Disease of Conceit. So to recap, in the 1980s, Bob starts out with 2 more Christian albums. Then he goes with a series of pretty disappointing albums, and it looks like he's in a real slump until George Harrison and the Traveling Wilburys come along. And boy, does his career take off again. All kind of typical for a decade of Bob Dylan. And as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist. So if you want to relive some of the songs that I've talked about that were on studio albums for Bob Dylan in the 80s, you can check out the link, and I'll put it in the comments below. In a future episode, we'll turn now to Bob's 4th decade in music and look at the studio albums that he released in the 1990s. Until then, thanks for watching, and keep it rockin'. If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.